Thank you, Dan, and thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here to share with you some of my work, some of my concerns, and some of my interests in children's literature, Sendak, and the Jewish imagination. And I'd like to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then open it up for questions and answers. And so I want to begin with a personal anecdote. The autumn when Where the Wild Things Are, probably Sendak's best-known work, the autumn that it came out, I was 8 years old, and I would kill time, back when I was 8, on those long Brooklyn afternoons. How many of you are from Brooklyn? That's great. So, you know, we're not native speakers of English, so I'll have a little... So there I was, 8 years old in Brooklyn, and I would play stickball, I would hang out, and one day I was playing stickball, and the ball went through the window of our landlady, because she had the ground floor apartment. And she came out. Now, this landlady is probably, at that time, no older than I am now. But back then, I thought she was the oldest woman in the world. In fact, she was so old that she had a tail. And she came out, shaking her fist at me, and yelling, Wilde Chaya, which, for those of you that don't know Yiddish, means wild thing or wild animal. I had forgotten, or actually more likely I had repressed this memory until I started to prepare my talk here. And I did a lot of research on Sendak. So I grew up in Brooklyn playing stickball, and on the web you can find this wonderful interview with Sendak, which begins by saying, I was never the kind of kid to play stickball. He remarks in that same interview that he modeled the characters of Where the Wild Things Are on his Jewish relatives in New York. But when I was a kid, nobody really talked about Sendak specifically as a Jewish writer. And the books that came out when I was a kid, the illustrations to the book Little Bear, Where the Wild Things, somewhat later In the Night Kitchen, they were received as remarkable books for their technical skill and their imagination, but we didn't talk about them as such, as products of a Jewish writer or books about the Jewish imagination. Sendak's imagination, for somebody like me as a child, really seemed more like the imagination of the Grimm brothers or even of Disney. That is, that he traded in archetypes. He traded in familiar images, monsters, ships, forests, oceans, bedrooms. And when I came to write my history of children's literature, I talked about Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, but I talked about it in relationship to Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. And I argued that it stands in the tradition of the young man going off on the ship of the imagination, finding in his little boat the cannibals of the world. But spending even the briefest amount of time with Sendak criticism, with Sendak on the web, or with the exhibit here at the Contemporary Jewish Museum, you can't get away from Sendak's Jewishness. Even Where the Wild Things Are, you could imagine, comes out of that deep memory of the Wilde Chaya. And in fact, I noticed on the web that many men of my generation have the same memory I do, of some landlady or somebody coming out and yelling at them, Wilde Chaya. And to this day, I can't find any woman of my generation who remembers being called a Wilde Chaya, either because it was a phrase uniquely reserved for boys, or because all the women of my generation were uniquely well behaved. Even if you go beyond Where the Wild Things Are, In the Night Kitchen, a remarkable book, a copy of which here is on display in the exhibit, you can see how there is a subtext of the Jewish experience. You can see in that book how the little boy, Mickey, is captured by these terrifying bakers. And in one review, they describe the bakers as looking like Oliver Hardy. But you know and I know that Oliver Hardy actually looked like Hitler. And so the bakers with their little mustaches are these strangely benign Hitlerian beings. Or look at Rosie in the stories of the Rosie books. the street that she lives on is very much like the New York street that I grew up on. Or look at Dear Millie, the Grimm brothers fairy tale that Sendak illustrated in an edition that came out in 1988. And you can see that the story there of the forest is now no longer the forest of the Grimm brothers' imagination, but rather the forest of World War II, the forest of resistance, or the forest of pain and death. But I want to think about Sendak as a Jewish writer or a Jewish artist, not specifically in these terms. In other words, I don't want to talk about Holocaust resonances. I don't want to talk about Yiddishkeit as such. I don't want to talk about New York. I want to talk about him as an artist, as a writer. And in that sense, what I'm going to spend a little time talking about is Sendak's relationship to a couple of other major Jewish artist-writer figures of the 20th century that Sendak has acknowledged had a huge impact on his work. And those two are Franz Kafka and Marc Chagall. Franz Kafka, the great Jewish German Czech writer of the early 20th century, famous for books like The Metamorphosis, in which Gregor Samsa awakens one morning to find himself transformed into a horrific insect. And Marc Chagall, the Russian Jewish French painter whose paintings such as I and the Village and Fiddler on the Roof have become, if you like, part of the iconography of 20th century Jewish imagination. So let me begin with Where the Wild Things Are and In the Night Kitchen. Both of these books begin with boys in bedrooms. Noises come. In Max's world, in Where the Wild Things Are, the noises come out of his own mouth. In Mickey's world, that is the little boy of In the Night Kitchen, the noises come from behind the door. Max leaves to sail his boat to rule wild things. Mickey falls out of bed, out of his clothes. Max escapes his mother. Mickey falls into a nightmare bakery. Max wears his wolf suit. Mickey, stripped naked, finds himself encased in dough. And in the end, Max comes home for dinner. And Mickey, too, returns to the safety of his room. These two stories, if you like, offer two sides of the same literary coin. That is, a story of disruption, travel, reclothing, and threat. They're stories that reach deep into the images of fear and of folktale, but they're also stories that evoke the specifics of modern Jewish life. How many nightmare lives began with a racket in the night? How many children fell past parents when a knock came on the door? How many were threatened with ovens? These correspondences come very easy to a reader reared on post-Holocaust history. But more elusive, but no less real, are the literary influences on Sendak. Sendak himself, in several interviews, acknowledged the impact of Kafka. And I want to now give you that opening of Franz Kafka's short story, Die Verwandlung, which translates as The Metamorphosis. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a monstrous insect. In the original German, the phrase is an ungeheures Ungeziefer, which literally means an unbearable bit of vermin, or like a dung beetle or something like that. And Gregor flicks his little legs over his body, and he says in Kafka's Metamorphosis, "What has happened to me? This is no dream." Like Kafka, Sendak is fascinated with the tensions between the horrible and the domestic. He sees the horrible in the everyday. He sees the insect in the bureaucrat. Like Kafka, Sendak recognizes that growing up is always a rude awakening. What has happened to me? This is no dream. This is the question that every adolescent asks. In an interview published over 35 years ago, Sendak reported that he loved what he called the strange and eerie works of Kafka. And there is, of course, something Kafkaesque about Sendak. What I'm suggesting by calling attention to Kafka's famous work is that Sendak, in effect, takes the opening of this metamorphosis and, in effect, turns it into a piece of fairy tale. Or, to put it another way, if you're somebody like me, who's both a reader, a lover of children's literature, and a parent on the one hand, and a college professor on the other hand, reading Sendak with Kafka makes you realize that Kafka is in his own way a great children's writer. All of Kafka's heroes, Gregor Samsa, Joseph K. in The Trial, K. in The Castle, they're like boys arrested in development. They still live with their parents. They still sleep in the rooms in which they grew up. Both Kafka and Sendak, I think, are also acutely sensitive to what I will call the iconography of Jewish difference. Ever since the Middle Ages, and in fact, going back to Roman antiquity, Jews, and in particular Jewish men, have been depicted as physically grotesque. Big noses, bad hair, ill-fitting clothes. This is an iconography that reaches back 1,000 years. A famous short story of the early 19th century called The Sandman by a man named E.T.A. Hoffman has a character in it named Dr. Coppelius, who is an inventor. And among other things, he invents a talking female doll. But he's also a lens grinder. He's a figure of mystery and a figure of horror. In The Sandman, he has, and I quote, long, greasy hair, a big nose, and an ill-fitting cloak. He is, quote, a horrible and unearthly monster. This is an anti-Semitic stereotype of the 19th century, and it's the same anti-Semitic stereotype that Charles Dickens will use for the figure of Fagin in Oliver Twist, who also has a big nose, long, greasy hair, and an ill-fitting cloak. This is the same stereotype as Harry Potter's Snape. Big hook nose, long, greasy hair, and an ill-fitting cloak. Now, I'm not saying that Rowling self-consciously presents in Snape an anti-Semitic stereotype. But what I do believe she's done is she's taken the imagery of 19th century fiction, in particular Dickens, and she's come up with the most repellent version of a figure she can. And these are, if you like, the building blocks out of which she puts it together. And if you've seen any of the Harry Potter movies, you can see that Alan Rickman plays him with all the theatricality of a Jewish vaudevillian. Now, in the early 20th century, Jewish intellectuals and progressives rejected this stereotype, but they couldn't help invoking it. I found a wonderful quotation from a Yiddish writer of the 19-teens named Moshe Litvacher. And as an old man, he reflected on the following. He says, and I'm going to quote to you. He says, I hated the shtetl alleyways with their hunchbacked, herring-smelling residents, the green Jews, uncles and aunts, and everyone saying, oh, you got so big. This is such a wonderful image because not only, I love the herring-smelling Jews, but the thing I love about it is the phrase green Jews. And I think what he means by green Jews are greenhorns. That is, people who are the nouveau riche, people who are new to the area. I think what, in effect, Sendak has done is he's taken this kind of imagery and he's made it literal. That is, he really has made his monsters green. So this great fear, see, when people of this generation, and this is the generation of my grandparents, when they came to the United States and they came to the American city, their great fear was that they would be found out, that they would smell like herring, that they would sound accented, that the old world would break through the veneer of the new world. This was the great fear of my parents, who rejected the orthodoxy of their parents and sought to assimilate. And I have this image of my father as a high school principal in Brooklyn, New York, terrified that one day he would wake up and discover that he was in fact really an insect. So you see the Kafkaesque quality about it. I think this is the immigrant experience. One day they're going to find me out. One day people will realize that I am, in spite of the accent, in spite of the learning, in spite of the cosmetic surgery, an ungeheures Ungeziefer. My mother was a speech therapist in the New York City schools, and she bled the Brooklyn accent out of my brother and out of me. But one day, there are times when I'm tired or excited, and every now and then it will slip through. And so if you want to try to trip me up in the discussion, I welcome you to find the monster in my mouth. Sendak taps into something of what I think of as this collective Jewish memory, as if the wild things were the things we were really all out to escape, and that these sweet American apartments that we lived in were the refuge from the alleyways and the green Jews of the ghetto. So Max, in Where the Wild Things Are, is an immigrant of the imagination. He takes his boat not to America, but to the wilderness. And yet, it's a charming wilderness. In some sense, it's a wilderness domesticated by nostalgia. If there's something I'm suggesting darkly Kafka-like about Sendak, there's also something brilliantly like Chagall. Marc Chagall, if you know his paintings that I mentioned, Eye in the Village, Fiddler on the Roof, a truly remarkable figure in 20th century art. I think what you could say is that Chagall, like Sendak, found a way of turning these memories into a kind of masquerade. And many of Sendak's critics, and Sendak himself, have acknowledged the influence of Chagall's work on Sendak. But what I'm interested in is the way in which both Sendak and Chagall are artists of childhood. That is, what happens in childhood is a kind of externalization of your interior life. In other words, that what they're both doing is they're taking the fears, the anxieties, the fact that children live inside their own heads, and they make them real in some way. Now, what I'm saying is something about Chagall and Sendak and Kafka as artists, but what I'm also saying is about them as modernists. In other words, that when scholars like me use a word modernism, what we're really saying is we're talking about a literary and artistic movement of the first half of the 20th century that is about making the internal external, that is about experiments with language, that is about alienation and exile, that is about the tension between childhood life and adult experience. Sendak is as much a modernist as James Joyce is a modernist. Sendak is as much a modernist as Marcel Proust is a modernist. This vision of a parent, a nurturing parent who is lost. Think of the opening of James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man, or think of Proust's Remembrance of Things Past. What I like to think of is, in effect, modernism as a great children's literature project. At the beginning of Remembrance of Things Past, Marcel Proust writes about the young boy Marcel, who's really him. And one of his most pleasant memories, and I'm going to read this to you, he says, "When it was Mama who was reading to me aloud, and when she read aloud from novels, she left all the love scenes out. But she supplied all the natural tenderness, all the sweetness which they demanded. She breathed into quite ordinary prose a kind of life full of feeling." This is Proust about his mother. "Even the most ordinary prose becomes magical when read aloud at bedtime." You don't need Marcel Proust to tell you that. If you have ever read to a child at bedtime, if you were a child who was read to at bedtime, you know that. But it's also true that if ordinary prose becomes magical, ordinary objects become terrifying. Who of you hasn't woken up in the middle of the night and seen a pile of laundry morph into a monster? Who hasn't seen a glowing clock face as some terrifying visage of an angry clown? Marc Chagall certainly did. And in his diary, he has a wonderful entry, which I'm going to read to you. And he says, "At night, when I was frightened, I would call and my mother would take me. She was the best shelter. No hand towel could be changed into a ram." In other words, when she was with him, he wouldn't see ordinary things monstrously, he said. And then he goes on and he says, "No clothes could be changed into an old man." And here's the beautiful part. "No sepulchral figure would glide across frozen window panes. Neither the hanging lamps nor the sofa would frighten me as long as I was in Mama's bed." This is great comfort, but as I read these words to you, if you've ever seen a Chagall picture, you'll see these images. You'll see the ram and the old man. Or another way of putting it is to take that phrase and use it as a description of Chagall's art. That is, sepulchral figures gliding across frozen window panes. Eye in the Village, Fiddler on the Roof, all of his art transformed familiar domestic spaces into memory of, if you like, cluttered fantasy. So it seems to me that what links Chagall and Sendak is this shared sense of finding the parent's place in the child's dream. In the illustration in the night kitchen, Mickey falls, and the caption is, "He falls past the moon and his mama and papa sleeping tight." It's like pure Chagall. The comic jostles with the comforting. The moon is as much a character as Mama and Papa are. And if you've seen the exhibit here, you'll see that there's a whole part of the exhibit that's devoted to the figure of the moon in Sendak. And I would argue that it's similar to the figure of the moon in Marc Chagall, because this is a fall into the past. Now, parents can be good, but they can also be bad. For every comforting mother, there's a witch. Max's mother doesn't come off very well in Where the Wild Things Are. She threatens, she withholds care. She's a far cry from Chagall's comforting mother, and she's a far cry, too, from Proust's idealized mother. What about Mickey in the night kitchen? At the high point of his journey, after he has been baked into a cake by these tiny mustachioed bakers, Mickey falls into a bottle of milk, and he says, "I'm in the milk, and the milk's in me. God bless milk, and God bless me." How could this not sound like a cry of infantile nursing delight? Well, I could answer my own question by saying that if you've been in psychoanalysis for as long as I have, it could sound like nothing else. Now, I've been talking about the family and its importance for Sendak, but let me now talk about the theater. Sendak is a very theatrical artist and writer. He's collaborated with Tony Kushner in the Brundabar play, but even earlier, he has a theatrical sensibility. In one of the Rosie books, the one called The Sign on Rosie's Door, this is really a book about theatrical impersonation. Rosie imagines herself on the stage, and she says, "I am Alinda, the lovely lady singer." And when her friend says, "Can I be somebody too?" Rosie says, "Sure, you can be Cha-Charu, my Arabian dancing girl." Like Max, who travels far to tame the savages, Rosie and Kathy travel to impersonate the exotic. The name Alinda seems to me to evoke the old Italianate names of opera singers. I think of Adelina Patti as that turn-of-the-century opera singer who stands behind Alinda. But I love this, my Arabian dancing girl, Cha-Charu. I mean, let's face it, this is much less an Arabian dancing girl than some Catskills resort entertainment leader, right? Everybody do the cha-cha, okay? Or it's a blend of cha-cha and charo. And I don't know if you remember charo, Xavier Cugat's protege, who I grew up with, and I spent many, well, that's for another psychiatric session. I've said a great deal about Sendak, and I've said a great deal about Jewish life and Jewish imagination, but what about the worlds of children's literature generally? And in the next 5 or 7 minutes or so, I want to talk about comparing Sendak to other children's writers in the 20th century. And what I want to say is that Sendak, like many 20th century 20th century children's writers, is very interested in children's literature as a story of the creative imagination. See, Sendak's characters are performing artists, they're masqueraders, they're painters, they're poets, they're dancers. They argue for aesthetic life. And in this, they're very similar to characters in the books of Dr. Seuss, Robert McCloskey, E.B. White, and George Selden. Let me give you some examples. Robert McCloskey is that wonderful Maine artist and writer who's probably best known for One Morning in Maine and Make Way for Ducklings. But one of his most fascinating books came out in 1963, and it's called Bert Dow, Deepwater Man. This is a Downeaster, an old Mainer, Bert Dow, who goes out in his little boat, once again a little boat, and he goes out fishing and he gets caught in a storm. He takes shelter in the belly of a whale, a bizarre take on Pinocchio and the Book of Job, okay? So here's Bert Dow, and he's stuck in a whale, and he can't get out. How is he going to get out? And this is a beautifully color-illustrated book. So what Bert does is he recognizes that in his boat, he still has some half-filled cans of paint. So he starts splashing the paint onto the inside of the whale's belly. And eventually the whale gets so irritated that he coughs him out. But not before we see what Bert has done. And he's recreated Jackson Pollock's abstract expressionism on the inside of the whale. And at that moment, in McCloskey's words, Bert, and I quote, had found himself in paint. How many children found themselves in paint? What do I mean? How many baby boomer boys and girls, children of men in gray flannel suits and moms on Milltown, express their individual? How many of you remember Milltown? Yeah, that's very good. If you really were taking it, you shouldn't remember. In George Selden's Cricket in Times Square, an exquisite book published in 1960, one of the earliest books I remember, the answer is through song. And the story here is that Chester Cricket, a Connecticut cricket, accidentally gets taken into Times Square station on the train. And Chester Cricket has this unique gift that he can mimic anything he hears, including the broadcasts of the Metropolitan Opera played on the radio of the Italian family who runs the newsstand in Times Square. And eventually, Chester Cricket comes to the attention of Mr. Bellini, the voice teacher, and Mr. Bellini writes a letter to the New York Times. And the New York Times sends a reporter, and Chester Cricket gives a command performance of the entirety of Aida played on his legs. This is a wonderful story about the desire to be an artist in an everyday world. Or take The Cat in the Hat. Or another one of my favorites in the book Scrambled Egg Super, Peter T. Hooper. The Cat in the Hat and Peter T. Hooper are creatures of the late 50s. And the cat, I want to argue, and I developed this in some detail in my book, the cat is as subversive as anything in Sendak. Now, The Cat in the Hat showed up in was published in October 1957, okay? And during that year, several things happened. Sputnik went up, but Elvis showed up on the Ed Sullivan Show. Allen Ginsberg read Howl in San Francisco. Jack Kerouac was writing On the Road. The Cat Cat in the Hat is a beat poet. The Cat in the Hat, think about it, right? He comes in to this quiet, domestic world of little kids, and he like, hey, look at me, and he speaks in rhyme. And my favorite, of course, is in The Cat in the Hat Comes Back. He leaves a ring in the tub, and it's a big pink ring. And everyone's afraid that they can't get rid of the pink. And so the pink is the Cat in the Hat is the ultimate pinko. And the Cat in the Hat finally calls on his fellow creatures to blow up the pink and make everything Snow White once again. Okay? So you get the idea. The idea is that what's going on in children's literature of the 1950s are stories of subversion, where you have artistic characters who aspire to use language or creativity in new ways, and the challenge is to find a space for it. Even Stuart Little is like this, as a kind of strange, subversive creature. Like, what happened? One day, Franz Kafka woke up to find himself transformed into a giant dung beetle. One day, Mrs. Little woke up to discover that she'd given birth to a mouse. It is as Kafkaesque as anything. So to talk about Sendak as a Jewish writer of the 50s and 60s, I think we need to see him in contrast to these writers who I believe are working in the great American Puritan tradition. That is, the tradition not just of white Protestant America, but the tradition of simplicity and the tradition of the rural. What's dangerous in these other writers is the city. What's good in these other writers is the country. Stuart Little has to leave New York City and go upstate New York. He has to go up north to the heart of old Puritan America with its values of simplicity and pastoral agrarianism. Robert McCloskey's books celebrate small town or rural America. What I'm getting at is that if we read Sendak through this parallel tradition of American pastoralism, we can see that Sendak is also a great modernist because, like all modernists, he sees the city as the site of imagination. Sendak's imaginary characters are creatures of apartments and city streets. Let me put it to you this way. Maurice Sendak is the Philip Roth of Jewish literature. Loud, expressive, theatrical, with very ambiguous descriptions of the mother. A writer like Robert McCloskey is the John Updike of children's literature. Puritan, quiet, anti-theatrical, with celebrations of family life keyed to the pleasures of simplicity. In the end, what I would say is that Sendak shows us all, regardless of our origin, both who we are and what we can become, both where we live and where we can escape to. In this, he's probably little different from Defoe with Robinson Crusoe or McCloskey with Bert Dow. But where he differs from them and where he differs from this context of the art and literature I'm talking about is in his distinctive fascination with the wilderness of the interior self and with the recognition that to be a modern human being, whether you're a Jew or not, is to seek solace in a bedtime story, only to fear that the next morning you'll wake up an insect. I think I'll stop there, and we can have some questions. Thank you very much.
That was truly extraordinary. Thank you.
Was that okay? Yeah. Now this is being taped, so I have to carry the mic with me so that we will have the audio on this.
So this mic is for people to ask questions for the same reason. Does anybody have a question?
Listening to you, I was wondering whether Sendak didn't write not just for children, but wrote for the parents, for the adult, explaining, showing them what childhood is and all what it is.
That's a great question. Like all great children's writers, he writes for both. And I think the important thing is to recognize that the great way to read Sendak and the great way to read children's literature is always to read to or read with. That it's the experience of the parent with the child over a book like Where the Wild Things Are or In the Night Kitchen. Because the parent becomes both a guide to the imagination, but a comfort if the child gets scared. And I think that the layers of artistry in Sendak work precisely in that way. And I think you could say the same thing about the best of the children's movies. I remember when my son was about, maybe he was 9, he became obsessed with the movie A Bug's Life. And we went to see A Bug's Life like 25 times. And I realized, this is a movie for adults. This isn't just a movie for kids. This is a movie that was made by Steve Jobs' Pixar company. It was the first really important Pixar movie. And the theme of the movie is you've got these bugs, you've got these ants, and they really are very, very creative. And then you got these big, imposing grasshoppers. And the way that the ants defeat the grass... How many of you have seen A Bug's Life? The way that the ants defeat the grasshoppers is they build a fake bird. That is, they build a virtual bird. And in this allegory of the Silicon Valley imagination, you got to remember, I saw this movie with my son when I was living in Silicon Valley with all the other Silicon Valley dads. And we realized the grasshoppers are IBM and the ants are Pixar. Because the ants really are Steve Jobs. Right, went on my own. I'm creative. I'm not paying. I'm not paying tithes. But the grasshoppers, who are presented as these sort of evil. That's IBM. So in a way, it becomes an allegory of the whole making of the movie. How do you go out on your own and make a digital bird that looks so real that it can frighten the grasshoppers? So in answer to your question, children's literature should always be read together.
I think that Sendak is frightening. He's very frightening for children because so many terrors lurk in children's room. Who knows who's in the closet? Mm-hmm. Who knows who's under the bed?
Yes.
And he plays into that.
Yes.
And so I think a lot of it really is for older children.
Mm-hmm.
I would not let Sendak be read to. I wouldn't read to a 4-year-old about Sendak because I think it's just too much.
Well, let me ask you then. Let's play with this idea a little bit. Is this a good thing or a bad thing that he's frightening? You see, I understand what you're saying, that there's something deeply terrifying about this. And I can understand, how it is. And I would respond in 2 ways. I would never want to be an irresponsible parent. That is, I would never want a child who wasn't ready for a book to have a book. So just to say, why all these 2-year-olds are getting Where the Wild Things Are for your birthday is a mystery to me. So in that, I agree with you. On the other hand, for people of my generation, or for people of, the generation older than I am, we grew up in a terrifying world. The world was terrifying. I want to be absolutely blunt about this. People my age remember terrible, horrible things. And one of the things, Where the Wild Things Are came out the same fall of the Kennedy assassination, for example. And my memory of Where the Wild Things Are is intimately wrapped up with that. And one of the things that a terrifying children's writer may teach people is, listen, the world really is a terrifying place, but there's solace and comfort. And if you like, the fantasy of Where the Wild Things Are is that you can always come home safe for dinner. You see what I mean? In other words, yes, it's a scary book, but the lesson is there is safety in the world. And I got to tell you, there were a lot of times I didn't come home safe for dinner. There were a lot of times when I wanted to hang on to the end of that book. So I see what you're saying, and part of what I'm getting at is that maybe part of what Sendak is doing is he's as much chronicling the experience of living in the 20th century as much as he's giving voice to the child's imagination inside. And again, reading with the parent helps the child understand that kind of tension. So I think that's a really sensitive point you raised. Other thoughts, questions, personal experiences, jokes?
Hi. You mentioned his love of Chagall paintings.
Yes.
I was wondering if you came across anything in your research about maybe Henri Rousseau's paintings too, just the fantasy aspect to it,
Right.
maybe the Jewish aspect there too.
I
he's
think
Jewish.
that's a wonderful example. And look, we could chronicle lots of them. I'm glad you brought that up. Henri Rousseau is another perfect example of that kind of faux naive painter of the imagination, very keyed to childhood, very stylized. And when you think of that beautiful painting, what's the desert painting called? The sleeping. You know what I'm talking about? Where the lion nuzzles the sleeping guy in the desert and the moon is up in the back. I can't remember the exact title of that painting, but I'm describing it in a way that we know. Sorry? That's exactly right. See, that is a very Sendak-like thing, because what you have is this sense of a violent beast like a lion nuzzling, becoming tame, this vision of safety. And part of the question is, here he is sleeping. Is it a dream? You see, is the painting really a dream? Does it exist? Whose dream is it? And the desert, like the jungle, like the forest, and Henri Rousseau's paintings are full of deserts, jungles, and forests. These are the spaces of the wild imagination. So I think that that's an absolutely wonderful analogy. And I think that there are, in fact, a lot of painters of the modernist tradition in the late 19th, early 20th century that feed into Sendak's imagery, his sense of self, and that in turn, if you go back, I mean, this really is my thesis. My thesis is that what we think of as modern art and literature really is about children. And it's about this new sense, the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, that parents and children have new relationships, that children have imaginations, and that what art is about is remembering your childhood. Freud is a great modernist because that's what Freud is about. It's about, who am I? Let me remember my childhood, and I'll tell you who I am. That's what Chagall is about. So the issue for me is not to say, let's do Freudian readings of everything. The issue is to say that Freud, as a thinker, participates in a larger cultural movement that is about understanding who you are in relationship to your childhood past, and in particular, to your mother. So I think that that's the way to, see what I mean, to fit all these pieces in together.
I wonder if I could ask a question of you, which has to do with Bruno Bettelheim.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Freud a minute ago, and,
Right.
and his ideas about the importance of letting kids experience something difficult and traumatic as a way for them to know that they can manage it, and that's kind of a rite of passage that they have to go through. There's something important about them being a little bit scared.
You know, I think this is an interesting problem because I think the problem is really one of control. What is the area in which you experience that terrible thing? If you experience it in a book, what you know is that you can always close the book. You see what I mean? It's like saying, oh, it's just a movie or it's just a dream. That you close the book and then you open the book and then you close the book. And then, you go back and forth and you have control over it. I personally don't believe that children should be exposed to trauma. I was exposed to a lot of trauma as a child, and I pay somebody a lot of money 3 times a week to have to deal with that. So the thing that I want to stress is I don't know that children's literature is necessarily a guide for child rearing, but it may be a way of calling attention to the shared experiences of children and parents, especially during times of social upheaval, and finding a safe way of coping with it. Because the safest way of coping with it is in the pages of a book. Let me just follow that up. How many of you know Goodnight Moon? All right. So Goodnight Moon is another great work of modernist literature. In the Great Green Room, it's a list. And the idea is that you name things. There's a telephone and a balloon and a picture of the cow jumping over the moon. And the purpose of Goodnight Moon as a bedtime story is to say to the kid that even though when you go to sleep, in the middle of the night, the chair or the balloon or the telephone may look like a monster, that's really all it is. And so when you say, good night telephone, good night moon, good night this, good night that, you are, in effect, taking control over them, whatever they look like. But I think in other ways, Goodnight Moon is also a kind of elegy. It's a kind of memorial. It's a way of saying good night to everything, but a way of realizing, too, that when you wake up in the morning, everything is going to be there once again. It is the great green room. It really is a kind of great canvas of modernism in a kind of sense. So what I'm getting at is that so many 20th century children's books and works of children's literature fit so deeply into the things that we were taught in high school and college were high art or high poetry or great music. I mean, let's face it, the poetry of Goodnight Moon reads like Gertrude Stein. A rose is a rose is a rose, okay? This sense of repetition, which is so central to the modernist ideal. So if we think in these terms, we can see how part of the job of children's literature is to show how, by naming and renaming things, we can gain control over the world. Any other? I think we have time for one more.
We have time for one or maybe two more questions. But
Yes.
As we hold, can I bring this over?
It's on the tape, so he wants the question.
If we could also, if people have forms that they want to include in the raffle, could you also at this time just send them to the aisles and we'll pick them up?
I think to also add to what you're saying, that at a literal level, the text of Goodnight Moon and books like Goodnight Moon that do the repetition, ultimately it really does help children to learn how to read.
Absolutely.
So I think that also needs to be stated.
That's right.
That part of the purpose of reading
Well,
out loud to children
that's
is for
right.
them to internalize the rhythm of the text.
That's right. The theme of my history of children's literature is the making of the literate imagination. That is, when I set out to write this, I had to say, what is the thing that's going to yoke all of this stuff together? And what I decided was I was going to look at the traditions of children's literature that taught children that reading was a good thing, that the world is a book, and that reading the book is like reading the world is like reading the book. So I agree with you completely. They teach reading as a social good, and it shows that the experience of living in the world is like reading. I read your face. You read signs. You see what I'm getting at? We live in a literate world, by which I don't simply mean a world of letters, but a world of signs and symbols that we read. And so that really dovetails with this larger sense of what I'm getting at, which is the reading together experience as literacy as a form of family bonding in that way.
I'm waiting for a larger envelope, so we have time for one more question.
Sorry, so I don't know if this is a little bit of a stretch, but it's just something I was thinking about through some of your answers about psychoanalysis and, finding yourself, through either the eyes of a kid or yourself as a kid. What sort of occurred to me is I was just wondering if you see any tie or any connections that you could see that Sendak and other of these writers were influenced by another one of these sort of monumental works, which is The Little Prince, which is not really a kid's book, but kind of goes both ways. So I think
that's a really good point. I mean, the thing about The Little Prince is that it comes out of that same cultural moment, and I think that there are strong comparisons between this idea of the child traveling to a distant place and the idea of the little prince traveling to distant places. One of the things that I find fascinating, just as an aside, about things that yoke together Sendak, The Little Prince, Dr. Seuss, so many children's writers, is this, that when you look at it, children's literature is full of hats. The Little Prince is full of hats. The cat in the hat has a hat. Max has a wolf suit with a thing over his head. There was a book that came out in the 30s that was republished when I was a kid called Caps for Sale by a Czech writer whose name I can't pronounce. No, it was something. That one. And in a way, what it's saying is, the thing about being a kid is you can always wear a different hat, right? You can always You know, that's what dress up is. That's Rosie, really Rosie. You know, she puts on all the hats. But, you know, it's a way of making alive the cliche of he wore many hats, right? You know, he really did wear many, many hats. And so what I think you see in The Little Prince, what you see in Sendak, in Seuss, in so many of these is this. I mean, you know, here's an idea. Reread your children's books for hats and ask yourself, where are the hats? Where's the headgear in the imagination? And if you can get your head around that, I think you'll have a really revealing sense of just how exciting children's literature is. And it seems to me, just to sort of wrap up now, that the excitement I have in children's literature is precisely the way in which I can find still these brilliant imaginative spaces in works that are written, as our first questioner asked, not just for children, but for adults like me who want to return not to their own childhood, believe me, but to a safer, better version of that childhood. Nostalgia, as someone very famous said, I think it was Frank Sinatra, is our desire for a past we never had. So on that note, I'll thank you again.